It was a typical Friday evening in the fall for me. I stayed at my office about 20 extra minutes to avoid the notorious end of the week traffic. It also gave me a chance to clean off my desk and organize a few files for the coming week. Plus, being single at the time, I had nothing to do but go home, eat some leftovers, and channel surf on pre-weekend worn-out shows until the wee hours. I eventually walked to my car in the near-empty parking lot to begin the journey home. I listened to a few songs on the radio and then switched to another station for some news. As I finally made my way into the quiet neighborhood where I lived, I took notice of all the usual sights. It was a cavalcade of streets filled with modest brick ranch houses adorned by grass lawns and simple planters. Dusk was earlier these days and it was dark enough for the street lights to be on. I pulled into my driveway and felt the coldness of the evening right away. My front yard was pitch black, and the nearest light some 60 feet away was half sheltered by a large oak tree limb. Once I got out of my car and walked to my porch, I used the flashlight on my cell phone to find the front door keyhole. As I took a step closer to the inside of my modest domain, I suddenly tripped over something but caught myself before experiencing a complete wipeout. The object I tripped over was a box obviously left on my porch by some delivery person, perhaps hours before I had arrived. I picked it up and carried it inside with me, pulling the door shut. Along with my keys, I placed the approximately foot-long box on my kitchen table. It took a minute or two of general unwinding, kicking my shoes off, and pouring a glass of chocolate milk, before I walked over to examine the box. I didn't recall ordering anything. And I wasn't expecting any type of gift. Sure enough, the label had my next-door neighbor's name and address on it. Once again, I almost broke my ass over someone else's package. My neighbor lived about 15 feet away with his wife, their two young somewhat hyperactive kids, and a dog. I was friendly with them in very general terms, waving and exchanging brief words from time to time. But nothing more than that. After all, as a single guy who enjoyed binging on cable TV and sports, and occasionally going out on Saturday nights, I didn't exactly have a lot in common with a family of four. After taking in part of a crime show and some entertainment news while finishing off a few slices of microwave-heated pizza, I glanced at my wall clock and noticed it was nearly 7:30. I moved the shade and looked out my front window. The neighborhood was spooky quiet. I figured everyone was probably home from work, and basically doing the same thing as me. I called my dad and chatted for a few minutes and told him I would probably make the hour drive to visit my mom and him on Sunday. I was now in shorts and flip-flops, and I walked back over to my kitchen table to re-examine the box. I lightly shook it with the same excitement as if it was my own. Maybe it was something my neighbor ordered for himself. Maybe it was something for his wife. Or maybe even something for one of his kids. There was no real indication as to what it might have been. Just a well-packaged box with a firm generic address label. I thought about how much I would want my package if it had been delivered to the wrong address. And just how crappy it would be for someone else to hold onto my package for an extra day, especially on what seemed to be a perfectly normal Friday night. So I grabbed my keys and the box and headed for my front door. I turned on my porch light and stepped outside, pulling the door shut. The sound of night crickets was everywhere. I walked to the sidewalk, then turned and looked up. A big bright full moon was positioned just behind my roof edge among a few scattered stars. At that very point, it was nearly mesmerizing. But the tranquil moment was cut short by the shrieking of two cats apparently engaged in a quick violent conflict. It made me jump for the moment and I nearly dropped my neighbor's box. I proceeded across the sidewalk to his house next door, and when I reached his driveway I noticed the only single light inside go out. It was at least an indication, along with their two parked cars, that someone was home. I approached their porch and noticed it was a lot darker than mine. Their outside lamp, which was usually always on, was off. Something else was unusual. There were no sounds coming from inside, which was a bit strange considering their two young children and the ruckus they usually made. They were among the loudest kids I had ever encountered. And I know their mother was not the type who would allow her kids to spend the night out. They were always close to her. I approached the front door and had to make a decision whether to knock or ring the small glowing bell button. I decided on the bell. My finger pushed it in and released it, and I could hear the ding-dong ringtone from inside their home. Then complete silence again. I waited. Then I reached out and pushed the button in again, and this time I held it in for an extra second. The ding-dong was a bit more exaggerated as I took a step back. Still complete silence. At this point I was almost getting tired of holding onto the fricking box. Then I heard the doorknob turn and the door squeaked as it slightly opened about 3 or 4 inches. There was even more darkness inside the house than outside. The situation was getting weird. I decided to speak up. "Hey, it's Ben from next door, I've got a box for you, they delivered it to my house by mistake." Whoever opened the door didn't answer back. So I spoke again. "I have your mail, do you want it?" It seemed like 10 seconds before an arm extended out from the dark interior behind the door. I leaned forward and handed the box off, not letting go until it felt like there was another good grip on it. I was a little freaked by the coldness of the moment, but still relieved to get rid of that box. I wondered if my neighbor was angry with me. Did I do something that upset him? The extended arm now holding the box retracted back inside the black space. I finally backed away and said, "Well, I'll be seeing you, have a good night." The door creaked closed. I listened for but did not hear it lock. I was standing there wondering what the heck just happened. I quickly moved back to my property. When I reached my front door, I looked over at my neighbor's house one more time. It still remained in complete darkness. I went inside my house and locked my door, double-checking to ensure it was locked. For some reason I did not want to put anything about crimes or mysteries on television. I switched channels, opting instead for an old 60s comedy show I had absolutely no interest in whatsoever. I briefly opened emails on my phone, but soon grew indifferent to reading any of them. I even pulled up one of my favorite battle games, but that didn't help either. My mind wandered, still thinking about what happened when I walked that box next door. Why did my neighbor act that way? Maybe he and the wife were having some issues. The whole encounter was so discomforting. Midnight came quick, and I eventually crashed out on my sofa with the TV on. I awoke the next morning to someone ringing my doorbell continuously. I got up and, despite a heavy bladder, briskly walked over to my front window and looked out. There were multiple police cars parked in front of my house as well as 2 ambulances across the street. There was yellow caution tape running up the side of my neighbor's driveway. I opened my front door and I was immediately greeted by 2 police officers accompanied by an older heavy-set guy who identified himself as a detective. I struggled to process the entire scenario. What I learned next affected me in my life like nothing else I ever experienced. My neighbor, his wife, and his 2 kids had actually been brutally murdered in their house, and their dog was also killed. The police suspected they had all been dead for at least 24 hours based on body decomposition. That means they were dead before I even arrived home from work. As I interviewed with police and reconstructed my steps regarding the box, I couldn't stop asking myself who was it that took the box from me. What made it even more troubling for me was a revelation one of the detectives eventually shared: they did not find a box in their house matching my description. Years went by and the case was never solved. I eventually sold my house and moved much closer to my parents. To this day, I still get chills when I picture that arm reaching out from the dark interior of my old neighbor's house. I often wonder, Who was this person, and was he still out there?